Okay, here we go. We are going to talk about the counterculture movement of the 1960s. Quiet, please. The counterculture movement of the 1960s, which will then take us into what I call the colorful and colorless 60s. But I'm going to kind of set up the colorful and colorless 60s by talking about what the counterculture movement was in the 60s, which was much different than anything we had experienced in the past. Now, let me ask you a question here. Counterculture, hippie movement, you kind of know what I'm talking about. What three social classes do we have in America? Upper, middle, and lower. Actually, we have more than that because we have people that fall in here that are called the upper middle class. And we have this area here which is called the lower middle class. Now let's think about the hippie movement as you know it in your mind. And I want you to think what social class made up most of the kids that took part in the counterculture movement. It was made up of what type of youth? Upper, middle, lower, upper middle, or lower middle? What would be your guess? Miss Lopez? No, Miss Lopez. Who are you picking?
The upper middle.
Upper middle. Okay, Shayna?
Lower middle.
Okay, how about you, Jonesy? Who would you pick of these five groups that had most people involved in this hippie movement, counterculture movement?
Lower.
Lower middle? Okay, how about you, Jess?
Lower middle.
Okay, how about you, Kaylee? Upper middle? Okay, how about you?
Lower middle.
Okay, you can pick these two, just so you know. Okay, what do you think, Saskia? That's four. What's that?
Middle.
Middle class? Okay, how about you, Emily?
Upper.
Upper class. Okay, how about you, Jess?
Middle.
Middle class. Josh?
Upper middle.
Upper middle?
Upper middle.
Upper middle?
Upper middle.
Okay. Middle? What do you think? Upper middle? Lower middle? Okay, how about you?
Upper middle.
Upper middle?
Middle.
Middle?
Middle.
Middle? Stacia?
Upper middle.
Upper middle. Okay. Lower middle. So you're either a loser or a winner, it sounds like here. Okay, what are you saying?
Upper.
Upper middle or upper?
Upper middle.
Okay.
Middle.
Middle class and
Upper.
upper class. Okay, this is very interesting. I've taught this class for millions of years, it seems like, and I've never had a ratio like this. Where do you think most of my marks have been in the past?
Lower.
Right here.
Oh.
Actually, the kids that were involved in this were upper middle class kids. Most people think, since it seems to be a low-life experience, that would be low-life kids. No, upper middle class youth made up the majority of the counterculture movement. That is a lot different. You guys have been kind of a unique class because I have had some things happen. I have never had this many marks in this area, that percentage. They've all been down here. So good thinkers. Now, what was the biggest symbol of the counterculture movement other than the peace sign? Something that hadn't happened much on one particular gender much in the past. No. I have to pull out my college photos for you.
Long hair.
Long hair in men. That was probably the biggest symbol of the counterculture movement. The biggest change, other than the peace sign, was long hair on males. It actually became a symbol of defiance. Ask my father. Between the youth of America and adult authority. If you grew your hair over your ears as a male, holy camola. Now you couldn't beg a kid to it. Things have changed. I can remember Ed Goyette when I was a 7th grader and took my first walk into Forsyth High School because it was a 7-12 school in 1972. And I walked in there and Ed Goyette was just mad because these boys had the gall to grow their hair over the summer, over the top of their ears, and came to school with facial hair. He was going nuts. He kicked Roger Birtle out the first day. You know what Roger did the rest of the day? Drove his motorcycle up and down Main Street. I am not making this up. I'll never forget it. I'll tell you another thing I won't forget later, okay? Anyway, this defiance, as I kind of started to mention, resulted in dress codes being implemented in high schools. Very emotional issue because in the 40s and 50s they really didn't have problems with dress code. But this counterculture movement made it a problem. I can remember Lenore Larson like it was yesterday. Told you this story.
Yeah.
Miniskirt. My God! When I walked in there in 1972 as a 7th grade, I went, no way! Right? And here's Ed Goyette after he kicked out Roger Berdahl. He had Marcia Denius and Lenore Larson sending them home because their skirts were too short. I thought they were fine as a fledgling 7th grader, but he did not like them. Anyway, that was a big deal. I can remember that. Facial hair, if you came with a beard. I'll tell you another quick story before we move on to this issue. I took the principal job, I probably told you the story, at Fort Benton High School in 1998. And I went in there and they needed a principal, came in because the kids were kind of out of control and they wanted new rules and they wanted somebody to step on these kids. So I met with the student council and I said, you know, I got to come in and put an attendance policy in. I'm going to have to come in and put a much tougher discipline policy in. What is some rule within reason that you have that you would like to see gone? It never took them 2 seconds. We want that facial hair rule taken out. This is 1996. I said, what facial hair rule? Well, the boys can't grow facial hair. And if you could take that out, man, that would make a huge impact on our kids. Done. For the first 2 weeks after that rule went out, I was the most popular guy in town. I saw the worst looking beards and mustaches I ever saw in my life for about 2 weeks. And after that, the only kid I could remember that had a mustache was Sam Rankin. The rest of them all clean, but it was the act that they could do, right? But dress codes became huge in the 1960s because of the counterculture movement. Now, these upper middle class youth that were involved in the counterculture movement became known as the Now generation. They became known as the Now generation. So these young, upper middle class people that involved themselves in the counterculture movement became known as the Now generation, which is our next subtopic. Now, obviously, this Now generation had their own beliefs that went against the grain of what American beliefs were prior to that decade. And I'm going to give you several examples, 8 to be exact, of beliefs they had that went against the grain that kind of took people by storm and tipped them over, the older generation. Okay? So here are 8 different beliefs that the Now generation had that was against the grain of American beliefs prior to that decade that caused some problems. Okay? First of all, they wouldn't be sitting in this class very happily because they believed that the past was useless, not worth notice or study. I don't say, oh, I agree with them because that was really because of my feelings. But that's what their first belief. Their first belief was they believed that the past was useless, that it was not worth notice or studying. So obviously history was not something they were interested in. Okay, they were interested in the future. So number one belief the Now generation had is they believed that the past was useless, not worthy of notice or study. Okay, instead of being interested, number 2, they lost interest in areas like math, science, language arts, and social studies. They lost interest in the 4 cores. They were not interested in the 4 cores. They weren't interested in math. They weren't interested in science. They weren't interested in social studies. They weren't interested in language arts. That's number 2. Number 3 is what did they become more interested in? 3 specific things. A little bit more, maybe broader.
Music?
Well, but not... Different things that we weren't used to studying. Mythology, astrology, and religion. So they became, number 2, less interested in the cores, math, science, English, social studies. Number 3, they became more interested in subject areas such as mythology, astrology, and religion. Number 4, matter of fact, they had a very anti-scientific attitude as well. A very anti-scientific attitude, the Now generation. You can ask Ed Goyette, because Roger Berdahl will tell you this. The 5th thing is they had a very strong rejection toward leadership. They had a very strong rejection toward leadership. Number 6, they became concerned about things that at that time wasn't that important, but we seem to think they're pretty important now, especially if you're a Democrat, and that's pollution and the environment. Okay, so number 6, they became concerned about pollution and the environment. And the 7th thing, there's not 8, I messed up. The 7th thing is they believed in a no-growth economy. A no-growth economy. What does that mean? It might surprise you. What does a no-growth economy mean? What do they believe in? No? It doesn't really make sense, but what do you think it is? No-growth economy. What does that mean for us Americans?
You don't have like different companies. You have like the main ones, and it's
So nobody has independent, they all work,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, really, when you think about no-growth economy, that's what kids say every year, it has to do with the economy. It really doesn't. It believes in stabilizing the population of the United States. They thought we were all going to be overpopulated, so they wanted to stabilize the population of the United States. That's what they meant when they said they believed in a no-growth economy. They wanted to stabilize the population. They even wore buttons that stated, quote, "Stop at 2." Meaning? Meaning? Only have 2 children. Yeah. So, the now generation, they would not be into the LDS religion, I can just tell you that. Or the Catholics. Yeah, or the Catholics, yeah. But anyway, they believed in a no-growth economy, which meant they wanted to stabilize the population and even wore buttons to support that, saying, "Stop at 2." Okay, that'll take us to our next subtopic, which you got to be a little mature to handle, and that's the sexual revolution. I have a lot less trouble teaching this today than I did 30 years ago, just so you know. The sexual revolution was another thing that was a big part of the counterculture movement, and it was the now generation that contributed to what we know as the sexual revolution. Okay, they were the ones that contributed to the beginning of that. Now, what do I mean by the sexual revolution? What I mean, just maturely, is attitudes towards a person's sexuality became more open. So being nude and being seen nude became more acceptable. Okay? Now, if you ever watched the old sitcoms like the Dick Van Dyke Show and all that kind of business, you ever watch those? Dick Van Dyke and his wife even had separate bedrooms in those movies, because by God, you couldn't put anything to make it think that they might be sleeping in the same bed on TV. That would be terrible. So the point I'm making is during the sexual revolution, you know, being nude and being seen nude became more and more acceptable. And the best example of this would probably be what? Where are you going to see more nude people than you had in the past? What? Well, maybe before, what? Well, before, TV wasn't as big, but before, movies. So the film industry became the biggest example of how this nudity was more acceptable, because prior to this, there was no nudity in movies. When the sexual revolution came about, they allowed frontal nudity. My God, in order to target teens and adults and get them to the movie theater, you had to have a little frontal nudity. Now, that was kind of discriminatory because it only dealt with women, so to speak. You know, I mean, you can use your imagination what I mean by frontal nudity. It's from the top up. Okay? So that actually became more of a thing that happened in the films in the 1960s. Now, they got a little Western, and they even got a little bit of, you know, showing some back nudity, buttocks and stuff. They weren't really into the, you know what I mean. And so because of this,
You're the one having trouble with this lecture.
this was a lot harder 30 years ago to talk about. But because of this nudity, both frontal nudity and maybe some minor nudity, what did films have to start doing? Rating their films so that parents would know what to show their kids. Now, here were the first ratings. They're different now. These were the first ratings of films in the 1960s. G, which meant general audiences. What was M? Mature, which would be our PG-13 now, probably. Then R has always been in there, restricted. And X was an X-rated movie. So it was G, M, R, and X when movies started to get rated in the 1960s. Now, we're going to talk about the sexual revolution, then we're going to go back to drugs. What do historians say was the most important drug that was taken during the 1960s?
Pot.
Birth control. We're talking about the sexual revolution. So historians, you got to be on topic here, Bert. Historians have stated that the most important drug taking during the decade of the 1960s was the birth control pill, because sexuality had changed. Now, we weren't worried about AIDS so much during the 1960s because we didn't know anything about it. What was the thing we were worried about when it came to sexual activity?
Baby.
No, hey, hell, we didn't worry about that. We're going to talk about that. That's part of the problem.
Baby.
What STDs, what at that time was called what? No, AIDS was later. VD, venereal disease. Okay? In my day, that was a big concern among males and females, because if you were active, you weren't worrying, especially in the 60s, they weren't worried about pregnancy. They were worried about venereal disease, or VD it was called. The clap was another comment. And not being gross, but what happens if you contracted such a disease, the areas in which you would contract that disease from became not a comfortable place to have some. You know what I mean, so to speak? You can look it up. But it was very obvious. It was very obvious that you had this disease, and it was very embarrassing that you had this disease, because you would have to go to the clinic and take medicine for this disease, and everybody in the clinic would know what you were doing. Okay? But VD was a huge problem in the 1960s. It spread like wildfire, especially in San Francisco. We'll tell you why there. So venereal disease was a huge problem. And when you hear about San Francisco, you'll know why. Now, we get back to the children. Somebody said worried about getting pregnant or having children. That was the least of their worries. Irresponsible adults and parenting started in the 1960s. Okay? These problems we have today started in the 60s. Okay? People were just, unwed mothers rose by the thousands compared to decades before. So this is where your irresponsible adults and parenting became a big problem in our country. It started in the 1960s. As I mentioned, the number of unwed mothers rose by the thousands, and young men fathered children everywhere and took absolutely no responsibility. Because in those days, did they have child support and courts and all that type of thing that would make someone responsible for their actions? No. Okay? So the number of unwed mothers rose by the thousands in the 1960s compared to decades before. Young men fathered children left and right, took no responsibility. Men and women lived in communes together with free love, no worries in the world. You didn't have to be just with one gal. Hell, there's a whole commune full of gals. Just, let's just have a good time here. Children born, who even knows if they knew who the parents were? Okay? And this is where sexist attitudes became more evident. And who started the sexist attitudes in the country? Men or women? No. Men did. Men are the reason why women had women's lib. Because what did men think? Men thought in the 1960s, I'll do my own thing and let the women clean up the mess. So the first sexist attitudes were on the part of men, which led in the 70s and 80s to what? Women's liberation, the women's rights movements, those types of things. But it was the men that said, I'll just do my own thing and let the ladies clean up the mess. I'll make all the children, they can worry about it. Okay, I'm going to show you a video when we get done with all this called the 1960s. It's so good. It's about a fictional family. You'll see this just evident in this movie. The attitudes were just very simple. So sex became a completely different game in the 1960s in comparison to the decades before. A lot freer, who cares, whatever. And that was a huge change for people. You don't really get it maybe because of the society we have today, but the change from the 50s to the 60s as far as sexual attitudes was just incredibly opposite. Okay, that'll take us to our San Francisco story, which is Haight-Ashbury, San Francisco, California. Now, when you talk about the counterculture movement, the actual center of the counterculture universe was simply where two streets met in San Francisco, Haight and Ashbury, where they met. That area of San Francisco, California, was the absolute center of the counterculture universe. Absolute center. And it was simply two streets meeting in San Francisco, Haight and Ashbury. It was at that area of San Francisco and blocks surrounding that intersection that you could witness the counterculture at its best or at its worst. Everything you ever needed to know about the counterculture movement and what it was about occurred in San Francisco at Haight-Ashbury. Now, all kinds of different people were attracted to San Francisco and Haight-Ashbury. You had students, college students that went there. You had high school dropouts that went there. You had professionals like lawyers and doctors that went there. You had rich people that went there. You had poor people that went there. You had just about every ethnic group available in the country that traveled to Haight-Ashbury. So again, you had college students, high school dropouts, professional people such as lawyers and doctors, rich people, poor people, African Americans, Hispanics, Japanese, Caucasian, everything you can imagine ended up sometime in San Francisco. Now, the people that went there, these people that decided they're going to go to Haight-Ashbury, they considered themselves pretty hip. Thus, the nickname hippies. Okay, they considered themselves pretty hip and took on a nickname called hippies. Now, what was the hippie style? If you saw a typical hippie boy or male, what would that person look like?
Long hair.
They have long hair,
Colored pants.
possibly more women would have more color, but possibly.
Colorful like clothes.
Fringy vest, bell-bottom jeans, probably hadn't showered in a week, is that what you said? You know what I mean? Women, same way, you know, colorful dresses, dread, no. I couldn't know. No, colorful dresses, no makeup, 3 or 4 children, seriously. Okay, so the appearance was pretty consistent. Now, one of the first merchants, businesses in this new Haight-Ashbury area was the Psychedelic Shop, which is on your ID sheet. One of the very first businesses that came to Haight-Ashbury, if you want to call it businesses, was the Psychedelic Shop.